Thanks everyone for being here. It's really wonderful to see you all. This is of course this semester's first by faculty for faculty lecture. It's actually the third of the semester. For those of you who have attended others of these sessions, welcome back. It's wonderful to see you. And for those of you who it's the first, it's really wonderful to welcome you here and hope to see you again in the future. This is the fourth year of this series, and this series started when in various conversations that I was having. Oh, by the way, my name is Rick Locke. I'm a professor. I'm a professor here in political science and international public affairs, and I currently serve as provost. And in the first year, when I was meeting with different faculty across the university, what was really clear was that faculty were really hungry for engaging with one another around substance, around intellectual work, not around committee assignments or space or things, scheduling or things like that, but actually learning from one another about the incredibly exciting research that takes place, and to be able to engage in that. And then so that's what we started, and it's been a tremendous success, whether it's lunchtime lectures or evening lectures. Every single one of them has been really filled to capacity, and that's really wonderful to see. This year, which marks the fifth year anniversary, or the fifth year of the Building on Distinction strategic plan, President Paxson and I thought what we would try to do is use all the different lecture series. This one, the presidential lecture series, we have another lecture series that we do for staff, et cetera, and to try to sort of anchor it in different themes related to building on distinction, since that is actually what's shaping the university over these recent years and over certainly the next 5 or 6 years. And we are especially pleased to be able to have Professor of Political Science Juliet Hooker speak with us today, because her work so nicely intersects with some of the multiple key themes of building on distinction. Juliet is a political theorist, specializing in comparative political theory, critical race theory, and multiculturalism. She's published widely on Afro-descendant and indigenous politics and multicultural rights in Latin America. She joined Brown in 2017 following a 15-year stint at the University of Texas, Austin. She's received numerous honors and awards for her book, Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos. She received the American Political Science Association's 2018 Bunch Award for the best scholarly work on ethnic and cultural pluralism, as well as the APSA's 2018 Best Book Award on race, ethnicity, and politics. These are for the non-political scientists in the room, these are really big awards. Her current research project, which we'll hear about more today, examines the politics of loss, aspects of which have appeared in scholarly journals like the South Atlantic Quarterly or even Political Theory. Those of you who were able to read the little description of this project, I think it's incredibly fascinating to sort of talk about how, what's being lost, who's feeling that they're losing something, and how it intersects with really very important debates that we're having in contemporary political life in this country. So I very much look forward to the talk. Juliet was born and raised in Nicaragua. According to a 2017 feature about her in the Havana Times, she moved from Bluesfield, the departmental capital of Nicaragua, to Nicaragua's South Caribbean region, to Managua, for part of her high school, and then she did I just learned, a year at Northfield Mount Herman, in Western Massachusetts, before going to Williams College, where she earned her bachelor in political science, and then later on went to Cornell for her master's and her PhD. Juliet is the recipient of many fellowships and awards, including from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard, and she's currently working on a book tentatively titled Black Grief, White Grievance. Please join me in welcoming Juliet Hooker.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you to Rick for the invitation, to Marissa for all the organizational efforts, and to all of you for coming here today. I started working on this book. I started working on pieces of what is now this book before I got to Brown, but it really has come together as a book project since I've been here. And so Brown has already proven itself to be a great place to think about these questions and to get feedback from my colleagues. So I look forward to getting more of that today. As Rick mentioned, the talk I'm giving today is part of a broader book project about different forms of political loss, their effect on the political imagination of citizens, and therefore how democracies should respond to loss. Specifically, I argue in the book that in the US during the Obama and Trump eras, the two most important forces driving racial politics in the US are Black grief and white grievance. Black grief is exemplified in the Black Lives Matter protests against police violence, which continue a long tradition of Black political mobilization catalyzed by Black death as a result of white violence that is subsequently channeled into public mourning. Simultaneously, during the Trump presidency, long simmering cries of white victimhood have crystallized into a potent politics of white grievance that frames the US as a white country under siege from threats from within and without at the hands of people of color, such as ungrateful and unpatriotic Blacks, criminal, I'm quoting, Latino immigrants, Muslim, terrorists, violent refugees, etc. Now, grief and grievance have the same etymological origin from the French term griever, to harm, which reflects the fact that they're both types of loss. Loss is both a universal human experience and a central democratic activity. To be a good democratic citizen, one must learn to accept loss. As the political scientists who work on democratization like to say, the game can't be rigged in a democracy. In the book, therefore, I want to argue that to understand the salience of white grievance in contemporary racial politics in the United States, we need to focus on the crucial question for democratic politics of how citizens cope with political loss. And now I'm going to present the talk today, which is from one of the chapters in the book in the section on white grievance. In August 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, brought together white supremacists, white nationalists, neo-Confederates, and various white militias who marched openly chanting racist slogans and carrying swastikas, Confederate battle flags, and anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic banners. They were met by counter-protesters, including students at the University of Virginia and activists associated with the local Black Lives Matter chapter who were determined to stop the rallies. Amid a late and tepid police response, the event would eventually leave over 30 injured and 1 dead after a man linked to a white supremacist group rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a white woman, Heather Heyer. Unlike other recent cases of non-Muslim Arabs killing unarmed civilians in the US, the attack was described as an act of domestic terrorism by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions immediately. President Trump, however, infamously chose instead to condemn, quote, hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides, and further claimed that there was blame on both sides. While the larger aim of the Charlottesville rally was to unify the white nationalist movement in the United States, its immediate stated goal was to oppose the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from the recently renamed Emancipation Park. After decades of inertia and indeed of construction of new Confederate memorials in cities throughout the United States, the Charlottesville City Council's decision to remove Lee's statue was prompted by the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, in which avowed white supremacist Dylan Roof murdered 9 African-American churchgoers in cold blood in hope of inciting a race war. Roof was an ardent admirer of the Confederacy. He posed with the Confederate battle flag affixed a Confederate States of America license plate to his vehicle, and prior to embarking on his killing spree, visited various historical sites in North and South Carolina related to slavery and the Confederacy, including 4 former plantations, a cemetery for white Confederate soldiers, the Museum and Library of Confederate History, etc. Roof's killing spree made him a martyr for fellow white nationalists. One of the Unite the Right rally attendees reportedly shouted, "Dylann Roof was a hero" during the march. Contrary to claims that they're simply tributes to fallen soldiers or attempt to preserve white Southern history and traditions, then the links between contemporary white nationalism and Confederate memorialization are undeniable. In light of this, we are forced to ask, what should the U.S. do about Confederate monuments? Why do some white citizens care about the removal of statues memorializing the defeated in a long ago war? In remarks defending his claim that counter-protesters were also to blame for the violence in Charlottesville, Trump sought to defend participants by saying, quote, "Many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So this week, it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson is coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?" End quote. Trump's defense of the Unite the Rally marchers illustrates what is at stake in clashes about Confederate monuments. He argued that the protesters were not really there to promote white supremacy or white nationalism, but rather to defend Confederate memorials, equating Confederate generals such as Lee and Jackson, who specifically fought a war to defend the right to be slave owners, and founding fathers such as Washington and Jefferson, who were also slave owners and who for the most part did not see this as a contradiction to the universal human political rights they claimed for themselves and fellow white property owners, is an acknowledgement, however, that despite the lofty rhetoric about political equality in its founding documents, the U.S. was founded as a white supremacist state, and most of its political leadership has upheld or defended that status quo. This acknowledgement makes it more difficult to draw a hard and fast distinction between the Confederacy's commitment to slavery and the acceptance of other less extreme forms of black subordination in other eras. On the surface, the question, where does it stop, is an attempt to align defenders of Confederate memorials with those who are willing to dispense with commemorating Lee and Jackson, but who would be troubled if Washington and Jefferson were to receive the same treatment. But there's also a deeper meaning to the plaintive and angry query, where will it stop? If we disavow the Confederacy, what further political losses will follow? I thus want to reorient the debate about Confederate memorials in light of the problem of political loss, and white political loss in particular. In other words, I'm interested in the civic and affective function of these memorials, since memorialization involves how those with political power within a given society organize public space to convey, and thus to teach the public, desired political lessons. So before we go on to talk about further, we have to see the scale of the issue we're talking about. And it's really quite astonishing once one delves into it, how ubiquitous in many Southern spaces in particular Confederate memorials are. To date, the most comprehensive database of Confederate iconography supported by public institutions, that is, not those in private spaces, is a 2016 report, Whose Heritage? Public Symbols of the Confederacy, compiled by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which undertook this effort to map Confederate place names and other symbols after the Charleston Massacre. It identified 1,500 Confederate memorials, including over 700 monuments, schools named after Confederate generals, various Confederate holidays, as well as cities and other places named after Confederate heroes. Now, when we look at the geographic distribution of these monuments, we also see that they're mostly concentrated in the South, which is ironic given this other slide, which shows the concentration of the Black population in the United States. I'm going to go back so you can take a look at this one for a moment. The Southern Poverty Law Center's report also rebuts claims that Confederate memorials are merely symbols of Southern heritage with no racist intent by graphing the timeline of when most Confederate monuments were built. Confederate symbols came into widespread use at two specific historical moments in the 20th century, when the status of white supremacy was highly contested. The first begins, as you can see here, around 1900, in the period when states are reenacting Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise newly freed African Americans and to resegregate U.S. society. The spike lasts well into the 1920s, a period that saw the dramatic resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, which is also a moment of widespread racial terror and the height of lynching. There's a second spike that begins then in the early 1950s and lasts through the 1960s as the civil rights movement led to a backlash among segregationists. And it's in the 1950s and 60s that, after having been sparingly displayed for decades, elements of the Confederate battle flag are incorporated directly into the flags of various and flown over various state capitals in the South, at a time when the flag was also a mainstay at Ku Klux Klan rallies and the various terror activities that they carried out. So, what have political theorists had to say about Confederate memorialization? Political theorists and philosophers who have considered the issue of Confederate memorialization have tended to frame their responses in terms of three main concerns. The first is how to balance the interest in free speech versus the interest of protecting citizens from racist harm. The second way they thought about the issue is how to protect the interests of defenders of Confederate symbols, right? How not to make them further aggrieved. And the third is they've considered the possible civic effects of public conversations about among citizens about whether to remove these monuments. For the most part, they haven't taken a free speech absolutist position that the removal of the monuments would violate the right to free expression of their defenders. Some have argued that, such as Michele Moody Adams, that the monuments cause something called what she calls expressive harm, and that they're expressions of racial intimidation and therefore should be removed. But like many others, she is concerned about the effect of removal on democratic ties among citizens. Others have argued that removing the monuments would be problematic and self-defeating, and that instead what society should focus on is on closing the monumentary gap between peoples and reframing existing monuments. Meanwhile, others have argued that the state should affirm the equal moral worth of all citizens, and that includes rejecting past racist practices and the symbols and cultural expressions associated with them, and that the state has an affirmative duty to ensure that memorialization conveys appropriate non-racist lessons and interpretations to citizens. But even those who take this position also tend to then conclude when it comes to, but what should we do? After affirming that principle, that no single approach is the correct one because each case raises questions of interpretation, such as, why did people choose to erect that particular statue, as well as questions of process. Who decides what to do? And then they're all, and generally, actually, the thing they all converge on is this idea that actually, as this is a classic move by political theorists, right? To say, the debate itself is a democratic good in itself, right? People coming together and having a conversation about this will be a good thing. So one of the things that I have noted then is that it seems to me that there's a weird absence in this debate, right? So to the extent that political theorists have thought about the harms of continuing, right, of the statues, they've thought about it in terms of how does this harm African Americans or others who see them as symbols of racial domination. What they haven't thought about is what potential harm do they do to the people who support them, right? What is the effect on non-racist whites as well? So I think there's another literature in political theory, the growing work on mourning and loss, which can help us think about these questions and about what civic work the Confederate mourning is accomplishing. And here I want to turn to two insights from this literature, which hasn't addressed the question of Confederate memorialization directly, but which has focused on 9/11 and other recent events in particular. So the first insight that I want to point to is this idea that fruitful democratic mourning requires a complex account of history that annihilates certainties, thereby opening space for individual and collective agency, which I think highlights how mourning for the lost cause embodied in Confederate memorials is precisely about avoiding complexity. The second relevant insight is the argument that different types of commemoration can impact the democratic orientation of citizens, so that certain types of memorials can become memorials to an ongoing sense of injustice, and so that despite claims that memorials are sites of healing, they actually exacerbate the effective impact of losses in ways that are potentially damaging to democracy. Confederate memorials, I argue, function in precisely this way, fostering a politics of white grievance that situates white slave owners as the real victims of the Civil War and their contemporary political heirs who aspire to political dominance as the similarly aggrieved victims of subsequent attempts to redress white supremacy, such as civil rights legislation, affirmative action, et cetera, et cetera. When we apply this frame to the issue of Confederate monuments, then we're led to ask, what is the loss being mourned or managed via these symbols? What kind of civic lessons about the character of democratic politics is being conveyed by Confederate memorials? I argue that Confederate memorials are about racial nostalgia for white political mastery, or the unchallenged expectations of collective racial dominance. And in order to illustrate this argument about what's at stake in Confederate memorialization, I actually turned to an unusual source, a contemporaneous account of one of the inaugural instances of Confederate commemoration in service of white reunion. That was written by the Cuban intellectual Jose Martí, who writes a detailed account of one of the first large-scale Confederate celebrations in 1886. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about that essay in particular. And I think turning to Martí is important because it enables a wider hemispheric understanding of the role that memorialization plays in shaping the political imagination of dominant groups. So my analysis of Confederate memorials centers then a living statue, if you will, as Martí's essay centers the figure of Jefferson Davis. Davis's tour of various southern cities, Montgomery, Alabama, and Atlanta, Macon, and Savannah, Georgia, to dedicate Confederate memorials only 2 decades after the Civil War, presaged the numerous statues that would be erected in his own image in subsequent years. Along with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Davis is one of the most frequently memorialized Confederate figures. Indeed, in my previous campus, there was a statue that has now recently been removed to Davis, who had no connection to Texas. Martí's essay on Davis is especially apt in light of the imagery in the Platonic dialogue, the Meno, that serves as the epigraph for this chapter. Plato referred to the works of the sculptor Daedalus that were so lifelike that, if not fastened, they were likely to play truant and run away, to illustrate the difference between true knowledge and opinion. His imagery of statues that play truant and run away is especially relevant because it goes against the general understanding of the work of commemoration as being about achieving historical closure, about drawing together the meaning of a particular historical event in a single speech or monument. But I argue then that memorialization shapes political imagination, so that despite the supposed fixity of monuments, Confederate statues embody particular kinds of political desires that can take on a life of their own in the present, as they did for Dylann Roof and the Unite the Right rally participants. And I am going to show you a little tidbit on the parade. Hopefully this will work. So anyway, this is a little clip that's put together by the Georgia Historical Society that describes this tour. This is the first time that Jefferson reemerges from his sort of seclusion after the end of the Civil War. And he goes on this tour and he has these huge crowds, and he's there to dedicate what will become some of these, what are now these sort of like huge avenues of Confederate monuments in various cities in the South. And he's met by these kind of rapturous crowds, and there's sort of this very positive and glowing coverage of his this tour, even in northern newspapers. So Martí, who's living in the U.S. at the time, writes an essay about it. And maybe we'll just skip the video and just keep going. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who Martí was. Martí is widely recognized as one of Latin America's most important political thinkers, and especially as one of its most important anti-imperial thinkers. Born in Cuba in 1853, in his short life, Martí pursued two principal political projects. One was Cuban independence, and the other was a project of Latin American regional political unity to oppose the threat of U.S. expansionism, which becomes increasingly threatening during his lifetime. As a result of being an advocate of independence, since Cuba is still a Spanish colony at the time, Martí was forced to live most of his adult life in exile. His most prolonged period of exile, actually from 1880 to 1895, he lives for the most part in New York City, where he had ample opportunity to observe U.S. race relations firsthand. At the time, Cubans were the largest Spanish-speaking community in New York City and the U.S. In the U.S., Martí was deeply involved in vibrant political and social circles of Caribbean exiles in New York City that revolved around organizations such as the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, which sought Cuban and Puerto Rican independence. The Cuban exile milieu in New York City and the U.S. was ideologically, racially, and economically diverse. It reflected the race and class tensions that threatened to divide the independence movements. It included wealthy white Cubans, working-class cigar factory workers, and Afro-Cubans. And the position of Afro-Cubans was especially thorny because of the importance of slavery in the Cuban independence struggle. Cuban Creole planters had remained loyal to Spain and not declared independence at the time that other Latin American countries did because of their fear that they would become another Haiti, and that there would be violent emancipation. But Afro-Cuban participation in the unsuccessful 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878 for independence led to a process of gradual emancipation where slavery remained, but those who had fought on both sides were freed. So slavery is finally abolished in Cuba by a decree of the Spanish monarchy in October of 1886, a few months after Martí published his Crónica of Davis's Confederate tour. Now, Martí's views about the U.S. were complicated. He admired U.S. progress, but he feared U.S. expansionism. In his Crónicas, he often marveled at U.S. cultural development and technological innovation, but also condemned U.S. materialism and greed, and especially U.S. racism. Martí's effusive praise for the United States and the Confederacy then, in a great Confederate celebration, is startling precisely because he was such a frequent critic of the United States, and because he's widely viewed as one of the more progressive thinkers on race of his time. So it's really jarring then, you're reading Martí's collected works, and suddenly, right, there's all these things about how racism doesn't exist, there's no such thing as race, and then there's a great Confederate celebration. You're like, what do we make of that? And this excerpt from one of his most famous essays, The Truth About the United States, kind of shows how we usually think about Martí, how Martí speaks about the U.S. and how he frames this comparison between U.S. and Latin American, the U.S. and Latin America in particular. Like other Latin American anti-imperial thinkers, Martí frequently engaged in hemispheric racial comparisons that simultaneously condemned U.S. racism and absolved Latin America by contrast. So the essay was written in Spanish for a Latin American audience. It appeared in La Nación, one of Argentina's leading newspapers. It's a ventriloquized reading of U.S. newspaper accounts of Davis's White Reunion tour. In terms of genre, it's part of his Crónicas about life in the United States, which are marked by ventriloquism. He adopts a narrative voice that situates him as a first-hand spectator of events compiled from sources in English without acknowledging the original source. So there are a blend of reportage, tableau, and essay that Martí writes as though he were an eyewitness from a collection of press releases that he took from The Wire or from American newspapers. Martí's ventriloquism then suggests that his essays often reflected U.S. elite sentiment insofar as they regurgitated coverage in northern newspapers, such as the New York Sun and the New York Times, while at the same time, of course, the essays obviously are also inflected by his own ideas and judgments about the United States. So in other work on Martí, I've argued that Martí's sketch of this inaugural instance of Confederate memorialization served as the occasion for a hemispheric account of White Reunion. By this I mean that one reading of the essay is that Martí views the U.S. Civil War through the lens of Cuba's ongoing struggle for independence and the anticipated problem of intra-white reunion in Cuba if independence is achieved, between Cuban nationalists who want independence and those who favor remaining a Spanish colony or being annexed to the U.S. There's also the problem of black-white reunion, as the status of Afro-Cubans in the yet-to-be Cuban Republic remained a major political question long after Martí's lifetime, even as his writings have been used to support conflicting accounts of the meaning of Cuban racial democracy. Indeed, drawing on Martí to analyze the work of memorialization is particularly fitting given that he himself is part of a commemoration triumvirate. Along with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, his is the most frequently memorialized figure in revolutionary Cuba. And this quote, I think, kind of points to this, this kind of hemispheric reading of what's going on in a Confederate celebration, that Martí is seeing this moment where the U.S. is able to acknowledge both the losers and the winners in a conflict. And I'm running out of time. But what I want to suggest to highlight is that in this chapter is the way that Martí's essay illustrates two of the features of Confederate memorialization that characterize it as a site of mourning with undemocratic effects. And one of these is the formulation or solidification of a narrative of Southern white innocence that depends on a claim that slavery wasn't central to the Civil War. This, of course, is an argument that's going to go on. This prefigures the argument of the Southern Southern historians, right? This idea that slavery is not what the war was about. And we see in these quotes, right, the contortions that Martí goes to try to make this claim. On the one hand, he says, slavery's over, we don't need to worry about it. On the other hand, he says, it really wasn't about slavery, right? And this, I think, is a theme that we see over and over in subsequent writings about the Confederacy and these memorials. And I can talk a little bit in the Q&A about the role of whether black folks appear or not at all in the essay, but I'm skipping that right now. So another feature of Confederate memorialization that I think we can observe in Martí's essay is the transfiguration of treason into innocence that would enable the memory of the Civil War to become about Southern white grievance against Northern political dominance, such that the real victims of the war, and especially of Reconstruction, would become Southern whites subjected to Northern mastery. In the essay, Martí describes the U.S. as worthy of admiration for allowing the former Confederate states to erect monuments to celebrate their fallen. Martí's admiration for martial forms of heroic masculinity was clearly aroused by the spectacle of this Confederate commemoration, yet it is notable that it is the Confederate statues, including the living one of Davis, that he absolves of the hollowness and vacuity of being statues made of sugar, which is how he describes the U.S. in this quote. So what I want to argue then is that we see in Martí's essay the beginning of this politics of white grievance directed at both local blacks and Northern elites. And Martí echoes supporters of Confederate memorialization by focusing on the heroism of the fallen and echoes the logic that by virtue of their bravery and the tenacity with which they clung to their beliefs, the injustice of the Southern cause was redeemed. It was ironically then patriarchal Southern whites who were overwhelmed by Northern might. And I think then that already in 1886, it's possible to see the work that Confederate memorialization would do in cementing a narrative of Southern victimhood and white grievance. So I'm wrapping up now. So I think Confederate monuments matter because they nurture white political imaginations oriented to mastery or sovereignty. If the experience of citizenship in democracies is paradigmatically one of frustrated sovereignty, as Danielle Allen argues, Confederate monuments do the symbolic work not of reconciling whites to the loss of mastery, but of investing them in it. They promote the idea of virtuous white victims who have made sacrifices for the nation in return for which they deserve never to have to be losers in politics. So one of the problems with the arguments that, public dialogues about whether or not to remove the monuments can have positive democratic effects is that it sidesteps the issue of what political work Confederate memorials continue to do. Not only do they reinscribe the politics of white reunion that emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War, where reconciliation trumped racial justice, they serve to reinforce white political imaginations that continue to be invested in white supremacy rather than to transform them. And I want to say that the solution that's often proposed of creating more black memorials, such as civil rights memorials, I think isn't the solution because it also leads to a segregated public memory. And these are also memorials generally to black activists. So what we continue not to have is any kind of civic memorialization of white investment in anti-racist activism. So I want to argue that removing Confederate monuments can be an important step in transforming white political imaginations. Accepting the loss of Confederate monuments can become an investment in a racially egalitarian political project. It may be that accepting loss on the terrain of the symbolic can serve as training, can pave the way towards the acceptance of material losses, such as the loss of unearned white advantages that would be required in a racially just society. Considering the issue of Confederate memorialization in light of the problem of white political loss, this allows us to shift the emphasis away from questions of process, as political theorists have tended to approach the issue, and onto the more fundamental question of what kind of losses are normatively acceptable because they're required for democratic equality. Democratic societies should not indulge or support their citizens in mourning losses that foster political imaginations and effective commitments oriented toward mastery, untrammeled sovereignty, or political dominance. Confederate memorials etch in stone a simultaneous narrative of white grievance, of whiteness under attack, and of commitment to never again be a loser, a fate to be avoided at all costs. The tragic outcomes of Confederate memorialization is the creation of a civic landscape of memory that nurtures Dylann Roof and those who lionize him as a hero. They worship at the feet of publicly supported statues made not of sugar, but carved in stone. And this is an image from Carl Walker's Sugar Spink exhibit at the Domino Sugar Factory. That is an homage to Black domestic workers and other kinds of people who produce sugar at the site of the factory. Thank you.
We have like 20 minutes for questions if people. Do you want to field them?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Hi.
And if people can introduce themselves.
Hi, Michele Mason Bisri. I visit in the philosophy department. The moral philosopher, the African-American moral philosopher, McAllister Bell, has written an interesting article where she argues that to remove these monuments is to ignore the important moral work that they could do. And she uses the example, I believe it happened at the University of Virginia, where students, in response to a memorial of Jefferson, took sticky notes and wrote racist, slave owner, posted them on the memorial. And she tries to argue that the kind of moral work of allowing these statues to stand as a site of oppressed anger expression is preferable to the kind of erasure of memory of these wrongdoings that she worries would happen. And she draws an important distinction between that kind of act and the act of, say, requiring students to attend classes in a building that's named after Robert E. Lee or something, because that, she argues, I think persuasively, is a kind of violation that differs from allowing a statue to stand as a site of a target for oppressed anger. So just wanted to invite you to say something about what you would think of that.
I think this is a complicated issue. You know, at UT, when we had this debate about what to do about the Confederate statues, I and many of the other faculty in African diaspora studies actually argued for that reason, not for removal, because they were already, the interesting thing about how they operated was that they were there, but the university never talked about them. It never acknowledged that they were there, you know. So it was this sort of weird way in which it was part of the erasure, actually, of the history of racism on campus. And so I think that, you know, this is, I think this question of contextualization is an interesting one, because I think it points to the question of, you know, how do we think about what would actually transform people's investments, right? And the question is whether the sticky notes, I mean, the sticky notes are ephemeral. They'll be gone, but the statue will remain. So how do we balance that, right? I agree that erasure is not the answer, but I don't know that I think how far contextualization works, right? So that would be my response. There's a hand over here, yeah.
Excuse me.
My name is Lindsey Jones. I am a postdoc in education. Thank you so much for this talk. I was finishing up my PhD at UVA when all of this stuff went down. And so it was extremely frustrating to see the national discourse go straight to call these people what they are. They're Nazis. They're Nazis. thank you for centering anti-Black racism in those protests and centering the backlash against removal of Confederate monuments in those protests. So at UVA, some of my colleagues were engaging with scholarship on the kind of microspatial placement of statues and the kind of work that they did in terms of what they posited, like surveilling Black communities or demarcating white space within Charlottesville in particular, but also, you know, cities like Richmond. And so I wondered, in your book, are you looking at the ways in which these monuments work to curtail political participation on the micro level, or to demarcate black space from white space, particularly given the timing in the early early like 1910s, 1920s, and in the civil rights movement, when there was, you know, the new Negro movement and renewed emphasis on civil rights.
So that's not a focus of what I'm doing, but it is a part of it insofar as, you know, one of the arguments that people make is that, is how do we know why people are invested in them, right? That, you know, maybe it's about Southern heritage, maybe it's not about, you know, that it's not about an investment as I would describe it in white dominance. And so part of the work for me of doing that, you know, some of the work that the value of that work is precisely in saying, well, when do they emerge? What kind of work are they doing? But what I'm actually also interested in thinking about is thinking about the role of counter memorials, right? Because one of the ways in which people have argued that one solution is either to integrate things like Monument Ave by putting in, you know, statues to African Americans, which would be kind of like you'd have a civil rights hero and then, I don't know, Robert E. Lee. I mean, you know, or things like the new lynching memorial, which, but then again, it's also like, what are we memorializing, right? We're memorializing the site, in the case of the lynching memorials, of Black victimhood versus, right, the sort of active, heroic, you know, Lee on his statue looking over, right, over the avenues or whatever. So I think we need to think about, you know, what kind of work they're doing and why people are attracted to them, and think about what kind of ways might we, do we have to think about what kind of political imaginations and civic attachments do we want to foster through publicly funded memorialization. Okay. I'll start with you. I don't know. I'm sorry. Ryan next.
Hi, I'm Emily Astor. I'm a professor in economics. So I wanted to come back to the thing to the president's quote at the beginning about, you know, where does this stop? What is next week? And I think that is a refrain which we do hear from quite a lot. And I often think about it in the context of some of the stuff that had came up a year or two ago at Yale, where they wanted to rename Calhoun College. But the question is, you know, how do you rename Calhoun College and not rename Yale, given that Yale himself was a slave trader? And so, you know, there are sort of a lot of these things we're going to struggle with. And I guess I wondered if sort of this paradigm, this kind of way of thinking about it is going to give any clues, or if you have any thoughts on the question of kind of how do we think about drawing? Is there a line? Do we want to draw a line? Like, how do you? I'm just curious how you think about that.
Okay, maybe I'll take a couple. So, in the interest of time, Brian.
Here you go.
Thanks, Juliet, and I'm particularly grateful for putting Marty on the interrogation block, because I think he needs to be interrogated, and you started to do that. But my question really is, okay, so. A regime can be sufficiently heinous, as in post-war Germany, that you eliminate all recognition of its existence from public space. And we accept that as something that should have been done to Nazi Germany. So what is the limit of heinousness that is required for the Nazi Germany formula to be implemented? Is it that slavery and what the Confederates did was bad but not so bad?
Okay, I'll take one more. Thank you. Nancy, then I'll go around.
Thank you so much. I wasn't sure if I sometimes have trouble hearing if you were saying affective with an A or effective.
Affect.
Okay, great, because that's what my question was about. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about things like shame and anger with respect to the way things are commemorated differently. So I'm imagining sort of a battlefield with a solemn plaque that is commemorating an event during the Civil War, but not celebrating a person. And how, no matter who's doing the feeling, it seems never to be about how Black people feel about it. And so the kind of intersections between power and affect in the way things are commemorated differently, even around the same set of events. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take you, and then I'll answer and take some more. Sorry if I'm missing.
Peter Allen, I'm retired. This is a somewhat follow-up question to the earlier one. We have the example of Nazi Germany. We have other examples in the world. What Russia has done with statues of Lenin and Stalin. And in Japan, the controversy over the cemetery visit a few years back. And my question is, although the Civil War and the monuments are really a unique American problem, do we have anything to learn from the way with which other countries have or have not dealt with their problems?
So I'm going to go ahead and answer these because I think they're actually all related. So in terms of the question of what is the limit of heinousness and where does it stop, which I think are sort of the same question, I'm not interested in thinking about it in terms of the, the kind of heinousness question, because I think that leads us down to these weird, like, okay, well, did they own slaves? Did they, so do we take down the names of, let's say, a Rhode Island factory textile owner who profited from slavery but wasn't the slave owner? Like, I don't think that's the way to think about it. I think what I'm trying to say is, let's think about, okay, as a society and as a democracy, we want to foster certain kinds of political orientations among citizens. One of those is towards racial justice or racial equality. Is this particular form of memorialization doing that, right? And I think there might be gradations, right? So it's not that all of them are the same thing. And this comes to perhaps, Nancy, your question. Like, I would be less concerned about, let's say, I don't know, a marker, right, at a grave of somebody who died during the Civil War than I would about, huge statue of Robert E. Lee or of, a spate of Confederate generals. But I think this question of, why it matters, I think this is why I start with Dylann Roof, right? Like, I think it's not coincidental that before he goes on this spree, he goes and visits these sites. He's getting something out of them. They're nurturing something in him, and we need to think about that problem. And I'm not saying that everybody who goes to visit a Confederate memorial is going to go and start killing people, but I'm saying, that I think we need to think about how, if we want to, right, not have more Dylann Roofs, think about other ways, about how we might foster different kinds of political imaginations and civic dispositions. And in terms of the question of whether we have something to learn from other countries, I think we do, and that is one part of the project that I want to develop, and this is why Marti's in there. I'm particularly interested, I will have to look, of course, one has to look at the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, but I'm particularly interested actually in Latin America, and in particular, I think, in Brazil and some of its own, debates about how to remember slavery and its slave past. which has become actually a pretty contentious issue in recent years. And there, one interesting question is about, right, who controls that memory, right? So are these representations coming from communities of people who are the descendants of enslaved people, or are they being created in sort of national museums, and how are those forms of memory different? I think I missed a few hands, so sorry. Okay, I'll start.
Can I ask you to speak into the mic? Just because we're taping. She's right here. Here you go.
Chris Roberts, Pembroke Center. Thank you for the presentation. My question is actually coming back to the notion of loss, and I was wondering if you maybe speak more about the way that, like, when does loss, would you say, where is that at the site point of removal? Because oftentimes I'm thinking about once it comes into the news or popular discourse that something is going to be removed, that's sort of when we see these movements happening. So how is your thinking about this notion of white grievance connected to, yes, quote, the war may have been lost, but we're still present in the public? And then is, like, so what, if you could speak a bit more about how the monument removal specifically maybe augments or puts a particular light on a loss that people have assuaged themselves that otherwise did not occur or did not happen, maybe.
Okay. Folks who, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question goes to what you were saying about Dylan Ruth, because I'm from Alabama, and next to the Department of Archives is like the Confederate White House. And it's nothing to see white families in front of that house or going to that house, taking pictures in front of it with their children in front of it. So it is, I agree with you that it is doing something for them. And I guess my question is that a function, is the connection purely what you would consider, like from your previous work, like a political solidarity that they're feeling with this? And also, is it a political socialization process as to where that they're learning and then it's becoming a part of their like everyday practice and things to believe these myths about the South and about themselves in general?
Mm-hmm. Yes, somebody back here, and then we'll come around.
My name is Nadia Ali, and I just joined Brown. I'm anthropology in the Watson. Just going back to Brian's question, there is actually a museum outside of Berlin where you can see some statues, a few selected ones, with the tour guide and, a very... I mean, you cannot just walk in. I mean, you have to go with the tour guide, and there's sort of school children are actually encouraged to go, just as a side note. But my question was more around, so listening to you, of course, this is a very US-specific experience and story. But when you speak about black grief and white grievance, I mean, it resonates beyond the US. So I've just left London, where I lived for 24 years, and some of the issues have come there up as well in terms of some of the monuments of British Empire. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of, especially in places at universities, Cambridge and so on, there are lots of debates. And I wonder, so how much of what you see here is something that is very specific, and what is actually more global? Or I mean, it's in the UK, it's clearly linked to British Empire, but we see it also in Germany unfolding, where we can speak more about political blackness and the racialization of Muslims and refugees. And so, I mean, I don't want to broaden it up, and I realize you haven't done that research, but I'm always now interested in what is unique to this country and what is actually happening on a wider scale right now.
Okay. Kevin? Yeah.
One last.
Kevin Escudero, American Studies. Thanks so much for the talk. I guess my question is, so when you were talking about counter monuments or kind of monuments in public spaces, I wonder what you might want to say about like less public spaces, so like museum spaces and exhibits that could produce a counter narrative in more of a contained space or a curated space that people are guided through, and if you see the potential for these kinds of museum exhibitions or kind of placing these statues and monuments in museums perhaps as a way of kind of thinking about some of that.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to answer these really quickly. I think that the question of when loss comes in is a complicated one, right? Because there are losses being mourned and also losses being deflected in in Confederate memorialization, right? So it's sort of this, this sort of, I think what people are doing is becoming socialized into a narrative of white grievance, right? Of wrongs, historical wrongs, to which they are now the heirs, and that give them a certain sense of particular identity, of particular grievances, right? So I think the loss both predates, right, but then becomes made part of a sort of line of grievance that goes into the present. But what I want to say about, the removal piece is in my project is thinking about how, what would it mean, right? So let me pose the question another way. If we can't even conceive of removing Confederate monuments, what can we conceive of doing to further racial justice? Like, if that in itself is not possible, what is possible? So so I want to say, yes, it would be a loss. That's okay. Some losses are necessary. Yes, controversial position, I know. In terms of the issue of how much is this a U.S. story, I agree that it's not just a U.S. story. The larger question about memorialization, about the struggles over what, about the way in which loss operates and works politically is a broader story. For the sake of this project, I've confined it to these two, right? These two trends in U.S. politics, but I think the larger story about loss, and I absolutely think, like, if, in some thinking of mine, I've argued that there's something similar going on with Brexit and with this sort of nostalgia for the loss of empire, right, in Europe. So I do think that there are resonances with various, and somebody, when I presented a part of this elsewhere, said that it resonated with some of what they were seeing in Japan, for example, as well. And in terms of the question, thank you, the question about museum spaces and exhibition, that's sort of where I want to end up, is actually trying to think about how can we think about processes of counter-memorialization or of memorializing differently that perhaps aren't about these sort of single monumental heroic guys, right? But thinking about what are the various ways in which we can undo the various problematic aspects of Confederate memorialization.
So that was really terrific, and clearly you made us think about this issue in new ways. Here's a small token of appreciation. Thanks. That was really terrific.
Thank you all. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. I'm happy to talk.